Welcome to the third session in our LDS history module. We're calling this section LDS Separateness, Beginnings to 1890, and we'd like to begin with a couple of ministerial considerations on how history can be used when you're dealing with LDS people. An important thing to understand is there's a lot of historical details. There's so much that we can talk about when it comes to Mormonism, and we could do 10 or 12 lessons just on who, what, when, where, why, and how. But that's not really what we find to be the most helpful thing for someone who is working in a regular ministry, perhaps even a part-time job in addition to planning a church or working in a parachurch ministry. So we want to paint with broad strokes and help you think of Mormonism in terms of sociological tension. What most basic historical outlines fail to do, while they might be great at giving you the details and the information, is they don't give you a sociocultural historical framework for thinking about Mormon history, the ways that what has happened has actually affected people in practical ways, and how we can look at patterns of behavior in people that we're going to meet in our daily lives. Why are they that way? A lot of times you don't get that if you're reading a basic book or a website. So we want to provide that level of information, and there are certainly plenty of great places where you can get the basic outline of Mormon history pretty readily and absolutely free, and we'd certainly recommend looking at those avenues. Our advice is to take the framework that we're providing here and to use that to understand the details of Mormon history. We think this is going to be a lot more helpful for our purposes than simply rehashing what you could easily find elsewhere. So on this idea of sociological tension, what we're talking about when we talk about sociological tension is the tendency of a religious movement to have struggles with people who are outside of the movement. If we say that there is tension increase with a religion, what we're saying is that they're very different from their surrounding culture, and this tends to cause problems between groups of people who don't agree with each other. When we say that there's tension reduction, what we're saying is that a religion has continuity with the surrounding culture. It's the tendency of outsiders to view the group as normal versus strange. It's the difference between a large group of Muslims, perhaps in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is maybe some people a little uncomfortable with that, versus medieval Europe, which was assumed to be Catholic no matter where you went. That's the difference we're talking about. So for our purposes, this idea of sociological tension when it comes to new religious movements allows us to pretty neatly divide Mormon history into the period of its beginnings up to about 1890 and 1890 up to today, which is what we'll talk about next time. The first main period of Mormon history is that of tension increase. Mormonism was not apparently so different from other religions at the time, actually, when it first started. Think about it. They have a Sunday worship service. They practice things like baptism in the Lord's Supper, even though they do those things a little bit differently. The idea of Mormonism being a restoration movement, this was very common at that day and age. Although they meant something different by it, it was still something that was continuous in the surrounding culture. And many of the doctrines taught in the Book of Mormon are not entirely weird or unique. Even Alexander Campbell, who was an early critic of the Book of Mormon, essentially said that what the Book of Mormon was trying to do was settle the debates of the day. It wasn't introducing something new and wacky. It was trying to settle what people were talking about then and there. So people recognized that there was plenty of continuity between early Mormonism and other different Christian groups that were cropping up like wildfire during that day and age. But in short order, Mormonism highlighted its separateness. So their idea of restoration is not simply of going back to the New Testament, as many others were saying at that time, but it's the idea of a resurgence of priesthood authority. And that changes the way that they viewed their culture and their structure as a religion. When they went around saying things such as Martin Harris, who was an early Mormon, saying that if people did not convert to Mormonism, they would be destroyed. Certainly saying and things like that is going to cause tension with outsiders. But plenty of religious groups had cropped up during the early 19th century without coming into harsh criticism or conflict with outsiders. So what made Mormonism stand out? The answer simply is that they organized themselves as a religious society. It is not simply that they had a church here, a church there. They'd meet together on a Sunday morning and everybody goes back to doing their thing during the week. when they decided and determined that they were going to have religious communities and inviting people from all over the region to come and live in one place, this created a lot of tension with outsiders. And despite the fact that early Mormons had plenty of continuity with other Americans, when they decided to form large communities, this made outsiders very unsettled. So the fear of that outsiders experienced in places like Kirtland, Ohio, Independence, Missouri, or Nauvoo, Illinois, and certainly, again, plenty of things happened in the development of Mormon theology and history during these periods, but the overarching theme is that of tension with outsiders. When people saw the Mormons congregating in large communities like this, it made them very uncomfortable. And here's a great quote from a Mormon historian, Richard Lyman Bushman, in his book Mormonism, A Very Short Introduction, where he explains this pretty briefly. Wherever Mormons settled, they met specific accusations: collusion with Indians, interference with slaves, theft, counterfeiting. But underlying them all was the fear of fanatics in power. Joseph Smith's enemies linked him to Muhammad, the arch-fanatic in the 19th century imagination. Both men claimed to speak for God through revelation, and the logic of the prevailing stereotype implied they would impose their views on everyone else. Joseph's enemies were convinced that he aimed to make himself a religious dictator, an American pope. So this was really the foil for Mormonism's conflict with outsiders, not just their doctrine, but what did their doctrine cause them to do? It caused them to come together as large communities, people who would vote in blocks, who ended up later even raising up a militia to protect themselves, made outsiders very, very uncomfortable with them as people. And it's this very tension that ultimately led to the death of Joseph in 1844 in Carthage, Illinois. Within a year of Joseph's death, the Mormon leadership realized that they had to leave the United States because everywhere they went, they were facing persecution and tension from outsiders, and it was even made quite clear to Brigham Young after Joseph's death that these attacks were going to continue happening because the death of Joseph did not disperse the early Mormons as perhaps those people who committed that act had hoped. Instead, it brought them even closer together. So Brigham Young led the majority of the Mormons. Of course, there was a little power struggle at this point in time, and some groups stayed behind, but the majority went with Brigham, headed west. Outside of the United States, it was determined they had to go to finally get away from the persecution that they were suffering and the tension with outsiders. So they went to the Utah Territory. It wasn't even a state yet. And in Utah, the Mormons were able to finally build a society in what historian Jan Ships calls sacred space and sacred time, essentially a theocracy. So this was finally a place where they felt like they were free to practice their religion, free of tension, free of conflict with outsiders. And it was during this time in 1852 where Brigham Young formally announced that the Mormons practiced polygamy. And this ended up causing a lot of tension with people back east when it was learned that this was going on. And although the Mormons had hoped that they could form their own theocratic society away from the United States in short order, more tension followed. And in 1857, President Buchanan ended up sending an army to Utah in what is a little historical caveat called the Mormon War to try and unseat Brigham Young. Basically, from the time they announced polygamy onward, they started facing very similar issues to what they had faced back east, except now they were in Utah. And ultimately, what you get is the same fear that they had been experiencing back east, as people were afraid of the idea of despotism. Polygamy was really just a foil for this. Polygamy was a way for people to see that the Mormons were a different sort of people living a very unique, theocratic, despotic lifestyle out west. And that was the fear, that was the concern. Except now, versus a state community being the ones opposing them, now it was actually the U.S. federal government was opposing the Mormons in Utah. And what ended up happening is anti-bigamy laws were passed. These were essentially used as a way to punish and imprison Mormon men. And it ultimately reached a point where almost all of the church's financial assets were on the chopping block. And the church ended up having to make a decision: if we don't stop polygamy, if we don't, in a sense, reduce our tension with outsiders and kind of join broader society, our church is going to be destroyed by the federal government. And so this is the event that preceded the 1890 manifesto that ended the sealing of new plural marriages. Now, this didn't end all those marriages. It just meant that they would not seal new ones. And in some pretty substantial ways, this event marks the end of that kingdom period. It is the space in which the Mormons had to realize that they could no longer live just as the way they thought that they were supposed to or wanted to. They had to, in a sense, play ball with outside culture if they were going to survive in the long term. And so in many ways, it is the end of that sacred space and sacred time. It's the end of this dispensation of tension because it was the recognition that they had to play ball. So here are a couple of important takeaways for this section. Understand that this history of tension with outsiders is what birthed the idea of the Mormons as a persecuted and suffering people that persists today. So this idea of the persecution complex, which we'll talk about in some of our other modules in this curriculum, largely has to do with their history of some of the things I've described here. This history of suffering and persecution that came out of the tension with outsiders is memorialized in Mormonism. Bushman says, "This is meant to imbue the coming generation with a resolve not to betray their heritage." And contemporary Mormons, they're not contradicting themselves by wanting to be a part of culture. I would suggest that it's not wise to try and play gotcha with people and say, well, look, early Mormons said and did these things, which were, they judged outsiders and you don't, and that's a contradiction there. It's simply inconsistent to do that, an inadvisable tactic in talking with people. We'd suggest that applying this framework to a broader reading of Mormon history will prove better and more helpful than simply giving you details. And we hope that you're able to take some of these ideas we've talked about here and now apply that as you're reading what actually happened. And we think that'll be really helpful for thinking about those things. So Mormonism ended up determining that it had to survive, and that to survive it had to adapt. It had to reduce tension with outsiders, with broader American culture, and that's what we're going to talk about in our next session.